Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me today. I'd like to spend some time focusing in on the clinical aspect of drug development. In our previous lessons, we've spent some time talking about the history of drug development, looking at the drug development process as a whole, where we talked about phases 1 through 4. We talked about the business of drug development, where we looked at some of the entities that develop pharmaceutical medicines. And today I want to now look at the process of the clinical trial and what it takes to get the data that's required for medicines to be approved. And so we're going to look at specifically the clinical aspect of drug development. So my goal for this particular learning module is that after you've completed it, that you will have a vocabulary to be able to discuss key concepts of the pharmaceutical clinical development process, that you will be able to examine the role of the patient and regulators in pharmaceutical development, and that you will be able to support clinical trial development with your patients who are perhaps interested in participating in a clinical trial or are already participating in a trial, that these concepts will give you the understanding that you need to be able to effectively support them. So let's take a look at what we're going to focus on specifically. We're going to look at the study design process. So before you could ever do a trial, you need to understand what it is that you're studying. And so a study design will look at the elements of protocol development, site selection, and the role of the institutional review board. We'll also take a look at patient recruitment and specifically informed consent. And we'll also look at some of the difficult populations to enroll in clinical trials and what that means for patient recruitment overall. And then we'll take a look at data collection and analysis, which includes the aspects of clinical monitoring and what it means when a study reaches its primary or secondary endpoint. So, the scientific road to discovery is a very long journey, and we often hear in the media about the pharmaceutical industry and how much it costs to develop medicines, but we don't really get a sense from the media of why. Why does it cost so much, and what is that all about? And what's interesting is that the process itself is fairly lengthy. It's a process that can take well over 10 to 15 years and can cost anywhere between 800 million and the latest statistic is actually well over $1 billion, as cited by Pharma in 2007. But it's a very lengthy process, and what happens is there are so many steps that have to occur for a drug to make it to market that the process is not only long, but it costs at each phase of development. So remember, when we talked about the phases of development, you can't just jump in and start testing a drug in humans. You have to go through a process, and so it can take a long time. And sometimes you can invest that money into doing clinical trials, and it does not yield any benefit at all because you find along one of those phases that the drug will not be safe or efficacious, and that money is lost, and so you have to start the process all over again. So how does a potential treatment get from the lab to the pharmacy? So if you have a scientist who has discovered a molecule that is a potential treatment, again, you have to go through the clinical trial process, and this is required by the Food and Drug Administration, who regulates the process of drug approval, and also indicates that before any drug can even be reviewed for approval or to be sold, it has to go through the clinical trial process, and it has to be able to demonstrate that the molecule that you've tested is safe and efficacious in treating a patient disorder. And the branch of the FDA that works closely with this is called the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And so they partner very closely with companies who are developing medicines to ensure that they are following the process of completing clinical trials, and that they also follow the process of submitting what's called a new drug application and an application for approval, which are processes for the Food and Drug Administration to review the overall application for drugs to be approved to be sold in the United States. And this is specifically, the FDA is the regulatory agency for the United States. So before you can even begin to think about testing a drug, you have to know what it is you are looking to answer. So you have to have a clinical question to answer. And to determine how you're going to do that, you need to have what's called a study design or a clinical trial study design. Sometimes those phrases are used interchangeably. And clinicaltrials.gov defines a clinical trial as a clinical study in which patients or participants are assigned to receive one or more interventions or no intervention, which can be known as the placebo effect, so that researchers can evaluate the effects of the interventions on biomedical or health-related outcomes. And the clinical study design is specifically the investigative methods used in the clinical study. So this is your plan. This is your research design. This is how you're going to answer the question and get the data that you need to answer this question. Once you have that, then you need to have a documented plan for that trial. And so how are you going to then look at this so that you are able to get consistent data wherever you decide to conduct this study? And so in doing that, you need to develop the protocol or the roadmap or the instructions, whatever it is you want to call it, so that wherever the study is implemented, everyone is doing it the same way. And so the protocol then would be the written description of the clinical trial design or the clinical study design. And it's there particularly not only to give you direction, but to ensure that the participants that are participating are safe as they participate in the study. Within the protocol, then, there's a description of who can participate in the trial, what the schedule of tests are there any tests that are associated with getting any of the data that you need, how often they're going to get the investigational drug, what's the dose that they're going to get, and how long are they going to be in the study. So all of this is the documentation of your clinical trial design, which is documented in the protocol. Once you have a protocol, then you need to figure out who's going to do the study, what sites are going to do the study. And so a lot of times you want to ensure that you have sites who have the patient population that you're studying. So for example, if you want to do a study on cardiovascular disease, you want to go to a site that has a lot of cardiovascular patients. It also helps to work with sites who have done clinical trials before. Because you don't have to teach them all of the aspects of how to conduct a trial at their site. But whatever it is, you want to make sure that the site is able to run your trial in an ethical way, that they're going to follow the protocol and they're going to follow what's called good clinical practice. And so sites are selected primarily by the sponsors of the trial. So if that can be a pharmaceutical company, if it's an academic center will be responsible for selecting the sites. And usually sites are selected by the what's called who has a principal investigator or someone who is interested in running clinical trials at their site, and you know that they are genuinely interested in research and going to do a good job. Then once you have your site, you need to ensure that each site individually has received what's called IRB, or Institutional Review Board approval. And the role of the IRB is critical in that not only are they giving you the opportunity to get approval for doing the study, but the IRB's role is specifically an objective one to ensure that the patient is protected while they are participating in the clinical trial. And this is really important because IRBs are regulated by the FDA to make sure that they're protecting human trial participants. and they are there to ensure that no unethical clinical practices are happening to the patient. And they came about in a very interesting way. So if you have any familiarity at all with uh, uh, clinical trial history, and we talked a little bit about this, you'll know that prior to having some of these regulatory requirements in place, there were some unethical things done to patients who participated in clinical trials. And one of those examples is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And so, briefly, this was a study that went on for a period of 40 years. It had about 600 poor sharecroppers who were primarily African American patients, and they were lured into participating in the study, being told that they were going to be given free medical care, free meals, free burial insurance, and they were never told, however, that they had syphilis. They were told that they had bad blood and that they were being treated for bad blood. And so they were not truly given the opportunity to give informed consent because they weren't given the information that they needed to make an informed decision. Along the way, in 1947, penicillin had become the standard treatment for syphilis, and these patients enrolled in this study were A, never told that a treatment existed, and B, were never given the treatment. And so these men went on to potentially die. Those who were afflicted by syphilis went on to die from that. And so lots of regulatory issues came out of that. Ethical practice statements came out. All of these things came out. And there are others unethical studies that are out there that supported this effort, but this is one of the most notable ones. And if you're interested in knowing more about this, I've included a YouTube video that will talk about this in your web resources folder in the learning module. Okay, so once you've gotten the approval of the IRB, once you now have your protocol established, you've got your site selected, now we need to go through the process of what's called patient recruitment. And how do we get patients in? So it's really important that we look at who can participate. And so we know now that looking at the protocol that outlines who can be a part of the trial and who can't. And within the scope of the protocol, we have what's called inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it's very specific as to who can participate and who can't. What's key about patient recruitment, however, is the informed consent process. It's very important that patients are given all of the information about participating in a clinical trial, not just the benefit, but what are the risks of participating in a clinical trial. And all of that information is documented in the informed consent document. The informed consent document is one of the documents that the IRB also has to approve. So they're looking at, can the trial be done at the site? But the IRB is also looking at the informed consent document. Does it present to the patient all of the information they need to make an informed decision about participating in the trial? And the informed consent process can take some time. It's not a matter of you just giving the patient the document and saying, here, I'll come back, you let me know if you want to be in this. You have to be very diligent about highlighting the risks of being in the clinical trial and highlighting what are some of those things that could potentially put them in a position of not danger per se, but that they are presented with all of the information that they need to make an informed decision. Once the patient has been consented, then you can go through the process of executing the trial as written in the protocol. Some of the difficult populations, so children are a very difficult group to get into trials. One is because they can't make their own decisions. So the decision about participating in a trial for children has to be done by the parents. And so this can be difficult because often the parents want to ensure that their children are going to get treated, so they don't necessarily want to be randomized into a study where they maybe get the drug or they don't get the drug. They want to make sure that their child is going to be able to get the potential treatment, and so often that can be difficult to get the parents to agree to have children participate in studies. One of the reasons for pediatrics that can be a difficult one is there was another study, and we talked about some of these unethical studies, where children during World War II were treated by Nazi doctors who conducted several experiments that were skeptical from a scientific perspective on children. And these children were in pain, and some of them were faced with critical disabilities, and some of them died. And so, as a result of that, the Nuremberg Code was created to ensure that children could be protected because they didn't have the legal capacity to be able to consent to participate in trials. And so, really important that we remember that protecting patients is a very key component of having them participate in clinical trials. And children as a population is a pretty sensitive one, but one that we want to ensure that we are protecting as well as any of the other populations. Another difficult population is the elderly. So when you get the elderly involved in trials, it can be difficult to assess whether or not any of the benefit that they're gaining from the drug or any of the adverse effects that they potentially are having from the drug are related to participating in the trial, because often elderly have a lot of comorbidities that could present an issue in being able to assess that. And another population that's difficult to enroll in trials are minorities. There's a lot of history that stems from the Tuskegee experiment, which we talked about earlier. And African Americans often have the sense when they're approached for participating in clinical trials that they're going to be treated like a guinea pig. And so it's a hurdle sometimes to be able to get minorities to participate in trials. So very important that as nurses, we understand some of this, some of these barriers that are in our way when we want to talk to patients about participating in clinical trials. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about data collection. Specifically, we'll focus here on the case report forms, clinical monitoring, and the data integrity and quality process. So this is it. I mean, the data is what you want out of a clinical trial. Patients are critical to the clinical development process, but once you've gotten that data, the data is really what's going to allow you to have the conversation with the regulatory agencies about whether or not this drug is safe and effective for use in humans and ultimately to be sold for the treatment of any disorders that patients may have. So the case report form is essentially where the data is collected. So each trial, each pharma company has different ways of collecting data. Some of them still do it by paper. Some of them do it digitally now, which can be convenient because that digital data can then be moved, rapidly into a database for assessment. But the clinical case report form is a paper or digital form that's used to collect the necessary data points from the patient while the patient is enrolled in the clinical trial. And data types for patients include demographic, vital signs, blood work, adverse events, anything that happens to them essentially while they're in the clinical trial is captured in the case report form. The case report forms then are monitored by personnel that either work for the pharmaceutical company or work with third parties to assess the data that's captured in case report forms to determine whether or not that data is accurate. And what we mean by accurate is, does the information in the case report form match the patient's clinical picture? So is what they've captured in the case report forms also captured in their medical chart for when they were in the hospital or even outpatient? Does it match? Does that data match what's listed in their medical record? And it's really important to check that because unfortunately there have been clinical investigators who have enrolled fictional patients, and if you have data that of course is not accurate or is fictional, then it can impact the overall data set to determine whether or not your drug is safe and effective. And so it's really important that there is a good monitoring process in place for any clinical trial that's being conducted. And then once all of the data have been verified in terms of whether or not it's accurate, then it needs to go through what's called an integrity and quality review process. It's transferred then to the sponsor's database where it's reviewed to determine the quality, the overall quality of the data. So did we get, any of that bad data? Did we get all of that bad data out of there? Do we have a good data set that will allow us to analyze it in a way that will ensure that we have what's called data of integrity, that we have good data that we can present in terms of the overall result of the trial. And most of this work, from the standpoint of ensuring the integrity and the quality, is done by statisticians and then reviewed with medical personnel to ensure that we've analyzed the data in a way that answers the clinical question that we set out to answer. So, as we look forward here, then we have to go to did we answer our question? So once we have all of that information, did the study answer its primary endpoint? Did it have its outcome that we said or that we predicted that the data would show us? Did it show us that? And if it did, then we've got a pretty good data set there. We look for the data to show us that it was positive in the sense that this is what we were looking for. And sometimes studies have secondary endpoints as well. Did it reach the secondary endpoint? It's not necessarily required that a study who has a primary and a secondary endpoint, that the secondary endpoint has to be answered. You're really looking at the primary outcome of the study. And so once the data has been analyzed, we can then answer the question, did we answer the clinical question that we set out to answer? So, in summary, it's important to know that new medicines take time. They really take time to develop. And we cannot do that without the clinical trial process. And we cannot do the clinical trial process without patients. And it's really important that nurses leverage the relationship that we have with the patient to help them understand that participating in a clinical trial definitely has benefits. It has benefits in terms of being able to be involved in looking at potential new medicines, but that they are participating for something that's bigger than themselves. And while they may not get the benefit from it, they may help to develop a treatment that will benefit others along the way. But just as the benefits are there, so are the risks. And it's important that we present that information to the patient in its entirety to ensure that they are getting what they need to make good decisions about participating in clinical trials. And so I hope that what we've covered here today will allow you to have a good working knowledge of some of the key concepts of study implementation, clinical trial implementation, and that you, as you work with your patients, will be able to use that. And so what I'd like you to do is you'll find on your in your learning module, there's a reflections link, and I'd like you to go to that link and jot down, if you could, what were your key learnings from this presentation? What were the key learnings that you had? And how will the information that you have now received inform or change your practice with your patients who are involved in clinical trials or even wish to be a part of clinical trials? And what will you do to learn more about the clinical trial process so that you can be impactful as you work with your patients? Thanks so much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson.